good afternoon, good morning. Welcome again. My name is Francesco Giassi. I'm working in the Assisted Voluntary Return and Integration Unit at IUM Geneva, supporting the activities of the Knowledge Management Hub. I'm going now to provide few technical indications on how the webinar will be conducted. The webinar will last for an hour. For the audio, we will kindly request you mute your microphone to avoid any noise that can disturb the participation of other attendees. At the end of the presentation of the IUM Reintegration Handbook, we will have a dedicated section for questions and answers. We actually recommend you to share your questions with us also during the presentation. We will then collecting them, read them, and we will do our best in addressing them all. As a last point, I would like to remind you that this session will be recorded and will be then available on the Return and Reintegration platform under this webinar section. I hope it's all clear. I now am very pleased to give the floor to Mr. Nicola Graviano, the head of the Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Unit, for his welcome and opening remarks. Over to you, Nicola.
So thanks again for joining us in this webinar on the Reintegration Handbook. My name is Nicola Graviano, and I'm the head of Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Unit here in IUM HQ. It is a pleasure for me to be here with you today to introduce you the handbook. This handbook is the last piece of a process that started a few years ago and that has aimed at reworking or revisiting IUM's theoretical and operational approach to reintegration. This webinar is organized through a new tool that we have just launched at IUM, which is the Return and Reintegration platform. It has been launched as part of the Knowledge Management Hub, which is implemented under one of the projects funded by the EU and DigiDevCo in particular, under the EU IOM Action for Migrant Protection and Reintegration. Today we'll have a look at the handbook in its entirety. We'll look at the different components of the handbook, and we will see how the handbook connects to the bigger picture, which indeed has seen in the past few years an increase in interest from different parties at the global level on issues of return and reintegration. Obviously, these themes connect very much to the SDGs. These themes connect very much to the Global Compact on safe and orderly migration. And as you know, there is a full Objective 21 that relates to this topic. And this theme is also gaining momentum for the follow-up of the Global Compact, and in particular under the EU Migration Network, where a specific working group is dedicated to return and reintegration related issues, and under which IUM is working with other UN agencies, in particular OHCHR and UNICEF, to put together knowledge and practices on return and reintegration. So we have a global picture that is for sure providing additional consideration, additional attention for this topic. And so this platform, this initiative, and the handbook also contribute to these global efforts of reinforcing capacity, reinforcing understanding about return and reintegration, and also providing tools for not only for IUM, but for all its partners, be them governments, be them UN agencies, be them NGOs, members of civil society, who are interested in return and reintegration related issues. The handbook, as we will mention also later on, is funded by DFID and complements all activities that IUM and its partners are carrying out in the field. I will stop here. Without further ado, I will leave then to Joy, who is the project manager of the Orion project under which the handbook has been developed. and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for the introduction. What I suggest that we do now for the next half an hour or so is basically to start with a brief overview of the basis of the reintegration handbook. Nicola alluded to it of several years now of work leading up to this handbook. We'll then look into the key objectives of the reintegration handbook and then go step by step through the content of the handbook, looking at the different modules. We'll also look into the training curriculum that is being developed based on the contents of the handbook. And then, as mentioned, we'll have a question and answer session. So you can feel free to write your questions as I'm presenting, and we'll respond to them at the end. So, as we explained, the concept of reintegration, of return and reintegration, of sustainable return, sustainable reintegration has been discussed over many years now globally. To try and organize a little bit the discussion and how IOM is working in the field of reintegration, we developed a definition specifically looking at what does it mean to have sustainable reintegration. So the definition is here on the screen, that reintegration can be considered sustainable when returnees have reached levels of economic self-sufficiency, social stability within their communities, and psychosocial well-being that allow them to cope with migration or remigration drivers. So having achieved sustainable reintegration, returnees are able to make further migration decisions as a matter of choice rather than necessity. So in this definition, there's quite a lot that is packed into it. We have 3 dimensions of reintegration: the economic, social, and psychosocial. We bring reintegration out of just the individual level of the returnees, but also placing them within the community and their countries of return. And we're explaining that further migration or remigration should be a matter of choice rather than necessity. So with this definition in place, we also find a way to measure when reintegration has been sustainable. So we, through a project funded by DFID called the Measure Project, we developed and field tested indicators for sustainable reintegration, looking at the 3 dimensions: economic, social, and psychosocial. So here we have the 30 indicators that were developed, different measurement elements such as satisfaction with the current economic situation, access to documentation, the sense of belonging to the community, and these were developed into a survey of 32 questions, which gives then 3-dimensional scores, so scores at the economic, the social, and the psychosocial dimensions, and a composite score, and it can go from 0 to 1. So based on the returnees' responses and their perception of their reintegration process, we can see at which level we can have a score of how the reintegration process has gone. So this was all developed and is now being implemented in several projects globally through IOM's projects. And on top of that, we've also developed a kind of framework, an approach to an integrated approach to reintegration, which takes into consideration 3 levels of reintegration, looking at the individual level, which addresses the needs, vulnerabilities of returnees and their family members. At the community level, looking at the needs, concerns of the community to which migrants return, looking at the families and the non-migrant population, and also at the structural levels where we can develop initiatives to promote good governance, engage local and national authorities and stakeholders to ensure that there's adequate public services and programs in place. There's also 3 dimensions, as we mentioned before, of reintegration, looking at the economic dimension, which covers aspects that contribute to re-entering the economic life, sustain livelihoods. The social dimensions, which looks at access to services such as health, education, housing, justice, and social protection schemes. And the psychosocial dimension, looking at personal support networks, contact with civil society structures, re-engagement with the local culture, traditions of the country of origin. And underlining all this is the monitoring, evaluation, and learning through the reintegration sustainability survey and scoring and other monitoring tools. So all this is kind of the basis for the Reintegration Handbook, together with the Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Framework that was developed last year. There are 6 objectives to the framework, and the ones that you see here are the ones that the handbook really tries to address. So the objective of returnees being able to overcome individual challenges impacting the reintegration. Then the objective at the community level, communities having the capacity to provide an enabling environment for reintegration. The objective at the structural level of policies and public services being in place to address the needs of returnees and communities. And an overarching objective looking at migrant vulnerabilities being addressed throughout the voluntary return and reintegration process. So these are kind of underpinning the contents of the handbook. So if we look at the handbook itself, it was funded by the UK Department for International Development and developed as part of the Safety, Support and Solutions in the Central Mediterranean Route program. It really aims to provide practical guidance on the design, implementation, and monitoring of the reintegration assistance. We have the integrated approach to reintegration that kind of gives the theoretical framework, but here in the handbook we really try to show how it can be put into practice in different contexts. It's guidance for IOM staff, but also for any reintegration partners, practitioners, and it has a global scope. We try to make sure that we can assess as many different contexts and situations as possible, and it will also be translated into French, Spanish, and Arabic, so that as many partners as possible can access and use it. As explained, it's really focused on reintegration assistance itself. It does not delve into so much the return process, although it's clearly there's a clear linkage between the two, but the focus is really on reintegration assistance. And as I mentioned, it's based on IOM's integrated approach to reintegration and the Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Framework, which means that the approach and the framework don't really look at internally displaced people, IDPs, refugees, or skilled migrants specifically, although, of course, a lot of the initiatives that are suggested and the analysis and assessment suggested can be applied to these types of returnees. So we'll now look more in detail at the contents of the handbook. And as I mentioned, we're really very closely following the integrated approach to integration, and that also is reflected in the way the handbook is structured. So the first module is an introduction module, kind of highlighting the integrated approach to reintegration, but also giving an overview of what considerations to make when developing reintegration programs, what kind of assessments need to be made. Then the modules 2, 3, and 4 look at the 3 levels of reintegration. So module 2 is at the individual level, module 3 at the community level, and module 4 at the structural level. And the 5th module is on monitoring and evaluation of reintegration initiatives. So now if we go more in depth into really what's underpinning everything that is described in the reintegration handbook, we have 9 key considerations. These are explained in the first module. The reintegration initiatives should be migrant-centered, so trying to promote the returnees' ownership, active participation of the process. Obviously, it should be sustainable, trying to always think of the long-term results and trying to see how support can be sustainable even after the assistance ends. Multidimensional, we keep repeating it and we'll repeat it again about the 3 dimensions: economic, social, and psychosocial. It should be strategic and tailored. So we put a lot of emphasis on analyzing the context and the return environment to make sure that initiatives are aligned with the specific situations. Adequately resourced, so programs will have to adjust depending on the human and financial resources available, which means in some cases we might have to prioritize or limit what assistance can be provided, and we can also advocate for additional funds when needed. A very important point is that is highlighted throughout the handbook, that reintegration assistance should be delivered through coordination and partnership. So all the initiatives that are explained and suggested in the handbook are really meant to be carried out in coordination with different stakeholders. It's not something that one agency or government can do on its own. It should be evidence-based, so putting a lot of emphasis on monitoring and on being able to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of reintegration programs. Of course, it should also be anchored on confidentiality and do no harm. So we make regular reference in the handbook to IOM's data protection principles, for example, and on how to place safeguards for handling returnees' data. And finally, we shouldn't forget that reintegration is part of a bigger migration government strategy. It can't be really taken on its own, but we should always be considering the bigger picture. So these are really the kind of key considerations that underpin everything that is described in the handbook. If we now look at the different modules, we have, as I explained, module 1 is really quite an introductory module so we encourage everyone to really read it to understand where we're coming from and what initial assessments need to be made. So there's a section on understanding return migration, looking at return types and motivations, and the evolution of assisted return and reintegration programs. We have a section on understanding reintegration. So that takes us again through the integrated approach to reintegration. and a section on establishing a comprehensive reintegration program. So that's where you will find the key considerations that we just went through, the different assessments that can be made when assessing the return context, and steps to take for developing a reintegration assistance program. The second module is probably the longest module in the handbook. It's looking at reintegration assistance at the individual level. So it starts with a section on case management counseling, what to consider, what are the essentials of counseling for case managers, and takes us step by step through the first counseling session as a key, as one of the most important steps of the reintegration process. Then we have a section on assessing the returnees' needs and skills, and there we go through different assessments that can be taken, such as the vulnerability assessment, risk assessment, family assessment, the skills assessment, and there we also introduce the reintegration sustainability survey that can be used as a baseline, as an assessment tool. So in this section, we also make quite a lot of reference to another IOM handbook that has just been published, the Handbook on the Protection and Assistance of Migrants Vulnerable to Violence, Exploitation, and Abuse. And there, that handbook goes into a lot more detail on looking at, on assessing vulnerability, on providing very specific guidance when assisting migrants in vulnerable situations. The next section looks at really the reintegration planning and follow-up. So it explains how to use the feasibility grid, one of the tools that is provided, the different components of an individual reintegration plan, and how to carry reintegration follow-up. Then the next three sections are divided up into the 3 dimensions. So the first one looks at the economic dimension, covering skills development and vocational training, job placement, business development support, access to banking and microcredit, and budgeting and financial counseling. Under social reintegration assistance, we have access to different services, access to housing and accommodation, to documentation, to social protection schemes, to education and training, to health and well-being, to food and water, and to justice and rights. And then we have the psychosocial dimension, which looks at counseling for psychosocial well-being and counseling with the returnee's family. There's also a section specific on devising a referral plan for mental and psychosocial support. And the final section is on case closure. Something I didn't mention is that for every module, we have a useful resources section, which provides some of the resources that were used to develop the module and other useful websites or resources that could be reviewed additionally. The third module really focuses on reintegration assistance at the community level. So it starts with how to define a community and engage the importance of engaging the community, making sure that participatory approaches are used when developing a reintegration plan at the community level. So there's also a section on community assessments and projects, looking at community profiles and analysis, and on different steps to take when developing community level assistance. Then again, it goes into looks at the 3 dimensions, economic, social, and psychosocial. So under economic integration assistance, we look at collective income generating activities, community-based local development and livelihood activities, and community financial support activities. Then we go into the social reintegration, and then the psychosocial reintegration that looks at community mobilization activities, peer support mechanisms, and community networks. The fourth module is focused on reintegration assistance at the structural level. So here we're looking a little bit more at the bigger picture. It's aimed more at an audience for local government and national government and local authorities. And there is a first section on stakeholder engagement, stakeholder capacity building and strengthening, and how to establish coordination mechanisms. The next section looks more at international cooperation, how to set up cooperation frameworks, different international cooperation models, and the facilitation of regulated safe mobility channels. And the last section focuses on strengthening national policy frameworks. The last module, Module 5, looks at monitoring and evaluation for reintegration assistance. So the first section is really kind of an introduction to understanding M&E and ethical considerations when carrying out monitoring and evaluation with returnees. And then it takes us through the M&E cycle if we want, looking at planning for M&E. So that goes through, takes us through the theory of change, results framework, different types of monitoring, and how to develop a results monitoring framework. Then there's a section on actually implementing the monitoring framework. We go through some common challenges when monitoring reintegration initiatives and how we can try to respond to those. We go through data collection, entry, cleanup, and then the data analysis and reporting. And then we have a section on managing and evaluation, and also importantly on how to generate knowledge from M&E and how to learn from the data that is being analyzed. There is quite a detailed section, detailed annexes. So throughout the modules, we make reference to further information available in the annexes. So the first annex is really, it goes a lot more in depth on counseling for case managers. So it takes us through some basic counseling techniques. It gives a bit more detail on the psychosocial approach to counseling. It gives some tips on psychosocial first aid and relaxation for people who are in distress. And then some more detailed guidance on first-line counseling for returnees with mental disorders and assisting migrants with a mental disorder. There's also counseling for reintegration planning and career counseling for case managers. We also have an annex on business development support, so that really goes kind of more step by step. It takes it a step further than what is in the main module 2. We have a reintegration plan template as an example. We also have quite a few M&E tools. So some common data collection methods. We have there a sample of the reintegration sustainability survey that I mentioned earlier. We have terms of reference for an evaluation and a checklist as well for evaluation. There's also an example of a feasibility grid. that is introduced in the main module, but there we have a full feasibility grid example. We have a stakeholder mapping matrix. There's also a matrix to address gaps in the quality and availability of services. There's further guidance on service mapping, what considerations to make, and what types of service providers to consider. We also have some examples of staff profiles for reintegration programs. And then the final annex is some key terms that are used in the handbook. So that's what we have right now, but it's really a working document. We're still working on different sections. We're working with UNICEF on an annex on reintegration of children and their families. We're also working with our colleagues in the Environment and Climate Change Division to develop guidelines for environmentally sustainable reintegration. And an additional annex that we would like to have are case studies that are already in the main handbook further developed, but also keep adding new case studies of reintegration initiatives by different practitioners. So if anyone on this webinar would be interested in also contributing some case studies from their programs, they can contact me and I'll send a form, a template that can be used, and then we'll be regularly adding case studies to the handbook. So at this point, I want to share my screen so that I can show you what the handbook looks like. I hope you've been able to scroll through it, but just a couple of things to show you. So this, for example, is the first page of the module 1. So each module has some key messages, kind of the key takeaways from the module. And there's, it highlights which audience, who the target audience is for this module. So for this first module, it's really for anyone who is interested in reintegration, from donors to case managers to service providers. We also have, as I mentioned, different case studies throughout the handbook that kind of illustrate what has been explained, described in the main sections. So for example, this one is on family and community dialogue in Ghana. We have one on the Puebla process, on return and reintegration, for example. So I really invite you to scroll through it. The easiest way I found to go through the handbook is by using the table of contents on the side that will take you to the different sections as you need. There's also links within the handbook itself to the relevant sections when they're mentioned. So yeah, I encourage you to go through it and take what is most relevant to you. Try and go back. So as I mentioned, based on the handbook's contents, we're also finalizing now a reintegration training curriculum. So it will be there will be an online training course, which is really kind of giving an overview of all the key points of the handbook. It really takes you through each module. It's a self-paced training course, and the participant really goes through module by module the key points of the contents of the handbook. It will be accessible for low bandwidth, so that as many partners can connect as possible. And it can be complemented by the face-to-face training sessions. It can be used, let's say, as an introduction, and then go more in depth in the face-to-face training modules. We're also finalizing these face-to-face modules, which are really meant to be very participative, based around very practical exercises, and trying to take the existing knowledge of participants as a basis, and also using that knowledge to really contextualize what is being described in the handbook. So this training will be for IOM staff to facilitate, and they'll be able to take different sessions as are needed, depending on the target audience. So for example, if there's a training specifically for case managers, they'll take sessions probably more from the second module of reintegration assistance at the individual level. And so it can be kind of mixed and matched depending on how many days as well are available and who the audience is. So really, I hope that this handbook can be used for all reintegration practitioners. It can be used as let's say, as a starting point for common understanding on reintegration initiatives. It's really the handbook it's not like it tells you what you need to do and how it has to be done specifically. It's more different, lets you know what is the best case scenario, what is an ideal. Okay, I hope you can all hear me now. I think we will restart the presentation. I mean, we're at the very last slide, actually. So really looking at how the handbook can be useful for reintegration practitioners. It can be used as a starting point for common understanding on reintegration initiatives. You can use the tools for different stages of the reintegration process. We've already tried to provide as many tools as possible. It can be used as inspiration when you're developing or adapting reintegration programming. You can see what's been done maybe in different countries and contexts, and see if that's something that can be used and adapted for your own context. And it can be used for capacity strengthening of different stakeholders that are involved in the reintegration process. As I mentioned, the handbook doesn't really dictate what needs to be done, but it emphasizes more the need for careful analysis, participation of different stakeholders to develop and adapt reintegration programming. And as I mentioned, it really highlights the need for strong cooperation. It's not something that one stakeholder can do on its own. So I think we'll now pass on to the questions and answer sections. I see that there's quite a few that have already been asked now. So I'll pass the mic back to Francesco for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joy, for guiding us through the different modules of the Reintegration Handbook. It was a very informative session. We received a question from Joe Cooper. The question is related to the community. Approach, and it says on the overview slides that we presented, Joy, we didn't see any reference to communities. Example given, the approach is to be migrant-centered rather than community-centered. Equally, the adding on do no harm doesn't mention communities. It will be interesting to hear your reflections on this. For example, should reintegration programs be created with migrants and the community asked to participate, or vice versa? Thank you for the question. Let's see if we have additional questions that we received. No additional questions so far. I can kindly ask you to insert questions in the chat box. We will read that and try to address them all. But I give the floor to Joy. Over to you, Joy. Thank you.
Yeah. So on the assisting communities themselves, what we explain in the module of reintegration assistance at the community level is really that we need to take into consideration not only the needs of the returnees, but also look at what considerations, what's important for the community. And we kind of have to try and match those two. I mean, when carrying out reintegration assistance, it's migrant-centered in the sense that we're really looking at what the migrant, the returnee needs, but then we also have to make sure that that also matches with what the community needs are. For example, to give you an example, if we see that a need, might be a very simplistic example, but if we see that a returnee is returning with their children, and there's very limited schooling facility, and this is also something that is mentioned as a priority by the community when we're talking to the community members, then this could be a potential community level project. This needs to be something that addresses both the returnees and the community's needs. But at the same time, what we're saying is that we shouldn't just develop a community project that doesn't actually address returnees' needs. So that's where the basis is on the returnee migrant-centered approach. So there's a lot more information and detail in the community level module, module 4, the importance of the community's participation in the process of developing community programs, and a lot more.
Thank you so much, Joy. We received additional questions. Thank you so much for being so proactive and in attending this webinar. Handbook. The questions are, what are the steps will IUM be taking to make the handbook itself more accessible and usable? For example, a web app or app based with the extensive hyperlinks. And then, what status will the handbook have within IUM? The FID says, we understand that will be inspiration for external actors, but presumably within IUM it could be more towards mandatory. Over to you, Joy. And in the meantime, we are also receiving additional questions that we will read and address in a minute. I think that there was an issue with the audio. I'm going to repeat the question. The question is more about the next step of the reintegration handbook. The question from the FID says, what are the steps will IUM be taking to make the handbook itself more accessible and usable? Web or an app based with extensive hyperlinks. The second question is about what the status will the handbook have within IUM. The FID says, we understand that will be inspiration for external actors, but presumably within IUM it could be more towards mandatory. Over to you, Joy.
Yes, thank you for these questions. So on making the handbook more accessible and usable, we're looking at, first of all, we have the online training curriculum that will really kind of take the participants through the different steps of the handbook. It will really make it easier to understand the contents of the handbook. And we're also trying to look into how to make the handbook more, how to digitize, let's say, the handbook. Looking at maybe having a web app application that can also be used on mobile, and looking into a chat box feature where you can type in what you're searching for, and it will bring up the different sections that are the most relevant. So this is something that we're looking into, and will hopefully be developing in the next couple of months. And we'll and in the meantime, we have the online PDF version, which has, as I mentioned, different links to different sections as needed, and can be navigated through the table of contents. Regarding on the status of the handbook within IOM, so this will be the kind of the key reference when developing reintegration programs, and now that and for existing reintegration programs. As you'll see in the handbook, what we emphasize is kind of how to carry out different assessments, how to see what is feasible in different contexts. And it's something that we can't say to all IOM offices that you have to do everything that is in the handbook. Also because the contexts are so different, the funding is also very different, the way that the programs are set up can change considerably. So this can be used as, the handbook can be used as a tool to show this is the additional work that could be possible with further funds, with further resources as well. But in the meantime, we encourage the missions to adapt the programming and to take on the different tools that are there in the handbook. So it's a case of little by little, each mission will be able to work towards this, let's say, bigger vision. It's also, as I mentioned, it's also something that we're not saying that it's only IOM or only one agency that needs to be doing all of this. It's impossible. for IOM to do everything that is mentioned in this handbook. It's really trying to show what different actors can do and how the coordination can work between the different actors. So I hope this answers the question.
Thank you so much, Joy. We have collected another couple of questions. Irene is asking if we already have face-to-face trainings lined up in key countries, migration corridors, and she also asked if will the training materials be available in different languages?
Yes, so the face-to-face trainings has already been piloted in Guinea, Morocco, and Senegal, which are our pilot countries. There's also, now it's really up to the different IOM missions to carry out the trainings in different countries. We had a training of trainer at the global level with all the different regions. And I know that there's a few countries that have already carried out the trainings. For example, in Brazil, in Nigeria, and a couple of other countries. And there'll be more as the trainings are finalized. We should have the face-to-face, the final package ready at the beginning of next year. And the face-to-face will be available in French as well as English. For the online training curriculum, that will be available in French, Spanish, and Arabic as well, and should be available again at the beginning of next year.
Thank you so much, Joy, for addressing this question. We have the last one from Tumane. Tumane is asking which is the link between the reintegration to the development peace nexus. Let's see if we have additional questions that participants may have submitted in the chat box. We don't have additional questions, so I repeat the question, which is the link between the reintegration handbook and the humanitarian development peace nexus, or which can be the possible partnership in the future.
Yeah, I think the reintegration really shows, really can be that link, looking at the immediate return, maybe in situations of conflict, for example, and how that can be used as a basis for longer term development. We don't really focus so much on it in the handbook itself. But it's more about analyzing the context and seeing what is feasible in the different contexts, and how to then carry out a reintegration that will also, as we mentioned, take into consideration the communities that the migrants are returning to, and looking more longer term at the structural level interventions that can be put in place. So it's really something that is underlining the whole process, but that is not necessarily specifically mentioned in the handbook.
Thank you so much, Joy, for addressing all the questions that the participants kindly submitted to us.